And then in verse 8, he says, "You be careful that no one robs you through his philosophy and vain deceit." Robs you of what? Well, of course, you know, because we've just talked about treasures, that's what Paul is referring to. Beware that people don't rob you of the treasures of knowledge. And how would they do that? He says, they would rob you through their philosophies and vain deceit, which are after the tradition of men, after the elementary principles of the world, and not after Christ. This leads to another thing that we need to discuss tonight, not only the question of being competent to answer all of the attacks that are brought against the faith by learning to think as a Christian, bringing every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. And secondly, we've looked at the issue of neutrality, how they aren't and you shouldn't be. But thirdly, you need to see, as this text that we've just read makes clear, that when someone disagrees with your Christian faith, they are not simply expressing a disagreement about one isolated particular point over against one isolated particular point or belief that you have. What is really going on here is that you have two warring philosophies. This is the way Paul puts it in Colossians 2. He says, "Beware lest someone rob you through his philosophy." And how does he describe the philosophy that you should be aware of? Since I was a philosophy major in college and went on to get my PhD in philosophy, I guess I need to say just something in passing about how I don't think I was violating this verse when Paul says, "Beware of philosophy." Now, I don't know if you are aware of what I'm referring to, but every once in a while I run into people who say, well, this verse says you shouldn't study philosophy. Christians have no business going to the philosophy department at the university because Paul tells you, stay away from it. So real briefly, let me point out here that Paul does not say that. He doesn't say avoid philosophy, he says beware of it. Now, if I were to tell you that you should be cautious when you go in the swimming pool this week, would you interpret that to mean, therefore, you shouldn't go in the swimming pool? Is that what I'm telling you? Don't swim? Oh, it would be wrong for you to swim. No, I say be cautious about it. Be cautious when you drive your car. Be cautious when you use fire. That doesn't mean don't drive a car and don't use fire, don't go swimming. Likewise, Paul says beware, be on your guard, be cautious. He doesn't forbid studying philosophy. Moreover, what Paul tells us here is that we're supposed to be cautious not of all philosophy, but of a particular kind of philosophy that he describes very clearly. That philosophy which is vain deceit, after the tradition of men, and after the elementary principles of the world. He says, be careful about that kind of philosophy, because it'll rob you. It'll bring you down. It'll be a real bummer for you if you get tied into that way of thinking. And then thirdly, Paul says something here which completely contradicts the notion that Christians shouldn't study philosophy when he goes on to say that this philosophy is not after Christ. You see, by implication, if there's a philosophy that is not after Christ that Paul's really upset about, then there is a philosophy that is after Christ. And that's what we need to master. We need to be able to think philosophically as Christians, bringing every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. Paul tells us then in Colossians that Christ is the foundation and the ultimate standard for all philosophical thinking. There is a philosophy that is after Christ, but you better be careful, because philosophy which is after the traditions of men is contrary to it. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, the Apostle Paul tells us that the world looks upon the preaching of the gospel as foolishness. He tells us quite clearly that Greeks seek after wisdom. He's thinking specifically of the Greek schools of philosophy, I think. Not all Greeks were particularly seeking after wisdom, but you see the real capital of ancient philosophy is Athens, is in Greece. And that typifies the Greek and the Gentile mindset, looking after worldly wisdom. And in the eyes of the worldly wise, the gospel is silly and foolish. But Paul says, hasn't God made foolish the wisdom of this world? What the world considers to be wise, God has made foolish. And what God proclaims as His own wisdom, the world calls foolish. Quite clearly, you have two different philosophical approaches here. And they're at war with each other, and they're systematically at war with each other. They don't have the same standards or evaluation. They do not approach things in the same way. They do not have the same methods. They do not have the same starting point. Quite clearly, they don't come to the same conclusions. In Acts 26, verse 8, Paul speaks before Agrippa about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and Agrippa has his problems. And in verse 8 in particular, I want you to see, Paul says to Agrippa, why should it be thought a thing impossible that God should raise the dead? See, Paul realized that Agrippa's difficulty was not with the facts, not with the eyewitness accounts, not with the evidence or indicators in history of the resurrection of Christ. Agrippa's problem was that he had a philosophy of life and of reality that told him what was possible and what was impossible, and so he doubted that people could rise from the dead. But Paul says, now, stop and think about it, Agrippa. If God is the creator of heaven and earth and sovereign over everything that happens there, why would it be something impossible that He should raise the dead? It all depends upon your philosophy, your worldview. It all depends upon the presuppositions you bring to the facts. In 1 Timothy 6, verse 20, the Apostle Paul tells Timothy to beware of that which is knowledge falsely so called, pseudo-knowledge. And I think that's a good warning to give to you before we take a break here in our evening presentation. Paul says, not everything that comes to you parading itself as knowledge, as wisdom, as objectivity and truth should be trusted as such. Beware of that which is falsely called knowledge. And you're going to run into a lot of that falsely called knowledge in the modern university. Everyone, whether they're a believer or an unbeliever of whatever kind, of whatever stripe, whatever flavor or brand, everyone takes things for granted. Everyone has those things which they no longer question, but they just assume in their approach to the world. Everyone has standards by which they think we can discover more truth about the world. Everyone has things they take for granted that limit what they think can be real or not. You have those. You go to the market, and on your way out at the checkout stand, you see the National Enquirer and the Star and other newspapers like that. You see the headlines. Oh, there's obviously evidence. This girl gave birth to her own father, it says. I remember reading that one day. I didn't think I was going to get out of the store without just busting up. Somebody put that as a headline. This girl gave birth to her own father. But then again, you see, if I'm going to be completely neutral and not biased and so forth, I can't say what are the limits of reality. I should look into that, right? I should be open-minded and go examine the facts. Nobody operates that way. Everybody's got a philosophy of life that tells them what, because they take for granted, tells them what the standards for discovery are, what the limits of reality are, what our methods should be. To put it very simply, everybody's got a worldview. And when we come back after a 5-minute break, I'm going to talk to you a little bit more this evening about having a worldview, what it is, and I'm going to try to give you a map of the various kinds of worldviews that you're going to encounter out in the world today. Let's take a break.